Sure. Yeah,
That's emerging.
if you put a security layer into your software and there is an easy way of getting around it, but you have limited access to the software, it's better for the user to not have to go through that process. They can just hit a key sequence and skip that whole security layer. They're going to be more productive. So there's a beneficial way. Of course, it leaves you wide open to to bad actors, but if you have all good actors, then it's that's one way in which it could be very positive.
I wish we lived in a system with all good actors.
Well, if we did, I don't think there'd be much for us to do, because
no, I mean like, well, I mean there's bad acting in terms of hurt people,
yes,
but then there's also bad acting in terms of I mean, like there's just like unintentional harm, but then there's intentional harm, and then there's the intentional harm from like, I'm in pain and I think you're the enemy and I want to hurt you, but
to
you
protect
know, if I
myself.
did some healing, I'd be okay. Then there's the like, you know, I'm a psychopath, like I'm born with a different tendency towards aggressiveness and a lack of empathy, and it's just like I'm wired differently. And or whatever, like psychopaths or sociopaths are kind of a gray area there, but psychopaths, at least, there are people out there who, you know, they're only out for themselves. They lack empathy. They're gonna take advantage of the system. They're not doing it out of a psychological harm that was done to them. They're just doing it because, you know, they're the lion who's after the prey or something like that. There are people.
Well, oh, you just muted yourself. There we go. There are people, you were going to say.
Yeah, no, there are people who take advantage of the system, and it's not like they're just stuck in some polarization and they're just like they had some trauma or something and it just needs to be healed, and then they're ultimately a good person. There are people out there who are, I hate to say evil.
Yeah. I want to dissect.
But there are people who are malevolent because it's in their wiring to be malevolent.
Yeah. I'm liking that you said that. They're executing the code that exists, and there's potentially a high probability that that code cannot be altered, or at least we don't know how to do it yet.
Yeah.
Culturally.
Yeah, and maybe that's a better way to look at it, about whether or not the code can be altered rather than what caused it. Because like one of the distinctions between psychopath and sociopath is the psychopath is born and the sociopath is made, so to speak. Like the sociopath is the one with a traumatic upbringing.
Yep.
But regardless, they act in very similar ways. Or like people who are they're not quite sociopathic, but they're highly narcissistic. And lack empathy, and they don't tend to go to therapy. Like there's for these categories of people, and there's other categories as well, but like, or even like something like borderline personality disorder, where there is effective treatment for it, and some of them do actually go to therapy, but it's incredibly difficult. For change to happen. There's only so much change that can happen. So all those together, there are these nodes in the system that are potentially having a net negative impact on the system that we can't. This is what I mean by bad actors. Like we can't do anything about it. Like the best we can do is, you know, put some of these people in jail, or, you know, create restrictions on them such that they can do the minimum amount of harm. But that requires, and this was the thesis of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, it's like that requires being more cautious and more skeptical and less trusting, which is a net negative to the system being able to operate. Basically, like his thesis was like, our society operates on trust, on trusting one another.
Sure.
You know, to do financial transactions, either you need to trust that the person on the other end isn't going to screw you over, or that the system works, or like there's a lot of trust involved.
Sure.
But in order to the cost of that trust is that certain people are going to take advantage of that trust, like the Ponzi scheme guy.
Bernie Madoff.
Yeah, Madoff. Like there are going to be Madoffs. That is the cost of having a system, and the alternative is to do it a lot of how policing has changed in the last 20 or 30 years to being more like stop and frisk, more like being less trustworthy, more like we're going to pull people over just on suspicion. We're going to be like super extra cautious, less trusting. And there's ways in which that helps them catch more of the bad guys, but there's also a lot more collateral damage.
Right.
That comes from that.
Yes.
I'm trying to like summarize a book that is like a really long book and
sure,
complex and a lot of nuance and
sure,
and exceptions and all this stuff. But it's like we can manage the psychopaths, we can manage the bad actors, but the cost of that might be too much for the system. Like there's a delicate equilibrium in terms of like trust and distrust. Okay, I'm rambling and losing focus, but it's like I don't have the answers. And there's a certain degree to which the system is just going to do its thing. I think that was my whole point. Like,
yeah.
What's your reaction?
Well, I think there's something here for me around sort of the idea of the bad actor. And it's almost like, I think it might be a problem for us to like extrapolate it out of like a current moment situation or the context of a current situation. Because I think you can probably have obviously people who over the stretch of their life, their current life or present experiences, they would fall under some sort of social category of good person, but then they can be captive to something in a particular moment that turns them into a quote unquote bad actor, right? Which I think we would generally agree is one of two things. It's some form of developmental or childhood trauma, or to some degree, it is a quote unquote bad wiring from your development. Although even then, technically, that's still developmental trauma, in sort of in the womb or whatever. But that has me start to think maybe we should change the phrase that hurt people to, although this is so much more intense, broken people hurt people. And of course, that's so wrought with all sorts of implications, but I do have a problem. I do struggle with this idea of, the pushback of the idea of like, you're not broken. And it's like, I like the spirit of what I think that's trying to suggest. However, I think if we actually do believe that somebody can come into this world grossly miswired, they're not necessarily hurt. They are missing something. They are partial. I mean, we're all partial, but they're partial in a very fundamental way that makes it very difficult for them to operate like the rest of everybody else. And therefore they can't meet a social norm or a bar of what
it's the social norm. Like, I think this analysis needs more complexity. Like, I still think it's a little too black or white. Like, it's dependent on the context, first of all, if whether or not a person's behavior is causing harm. If the system is set up, if the goal of the system is, for individuals, for certain individuals, more the orange meme approach, certain individuals to prosper and others to fail and survival of the fittest, then in the savannah, it's perfectly appropriate for lions to hunt and kill, and the natural order where it's contextually appropriate.
Most places in nature, it seems to work that way.
Yeah.
And nature seems to work with the quote unquote losers, because if you look at different areas in nature where a particular entity or organism or whatever you want to call it is losing, it's also providing fuel. Like it's part of the system. It's part of the circle of life.
Yeah, yeah. The web. It's like it's super. I think it's super complex. Like, you know, is it that hurt people hurt people, or that broken people hurt people? Well, lots of different kinds of people hurt people, and sometimes it's innate, and sometimes it's you know, it's just a layer of programming that needs an upgrade, and sometimes it's a momentary thing. Sometimes it's just the state that I'm in. You know, I'm in a bad mood one day and I'm a little mean to someone, and a different day I wouldn't be mean to them.
Sure.
It's I think it's super complex, and then it's like, is the person's wiring problematic or not? Well, it's going to have some advantages and some disadvantages. I think it's more painful and less satisfying to think of things in terms of pros and cons, or within which context is this more helpful, but more helpful in terms of what. I think it's just super complex.